What if we had two suns? No one noticed the second one at first, not because it was small or dim, but because it rose so quietly behind the first that it felt like an illusion, a reflection caught in the sky, a trick of tired eyes that people dismissed as heat haze or some strange atmospheric phenomenon. But then the mornings grew brighter in a way that felt unnatural, as if the light was layered, too sharp, too full, shadows splitting into two directions and stretching across the ground like something alive, and the sky began to hold a strange tension, a silent pressure that no one could explain, until one day both suns stood side by side in full clarity, two blazing spheres suspended in the sky, not identical, but close enough to unsettle something deep within the human mind. One slightly larger, burning with a familiar golden warmth, the other sharper, almost white, radiating a colder, more piercing light that seemed to cut through everything it touched. And in that moment, the world understood that something fundamental had changed, something that could not be undone or ignored. And life began to shift in ways no one had prepared for, because time itself no longer felt stable. Days stretched longer, not gradually but suddenly, as if someone had pulled the fabric of hours and refused to let it fall back into place. The nights shrinking into thin, fragile gaps where darkness barely had time to settle before being chased away again. Sleep became uncertain, restless, broken into fragments that never fully restored what was lost, and people found themselves drifting through extended days with a strange mix of awe and exhaustion, unable to decide whether they were witnessing a miracle or the beginning of something far more dangerous. And the heat began to change, not just in intensity, but in character. One sun warming the earth in a familiar, almost comforting way, while the second seemed to amplify everything, intensifying the air, making it heavier, thicker, harder to breathe. And the winds carried a new kind of dryness that cracked the soil faster than it could recover. Rivers began to shrink, not disappearing entirely, but retreating, pulling back as if the planet itself was conserving something. Forests grew restless, leaves turning earlier, some trees blooming twice in confusion, unable to understand the rhythm they had followed for centuries. Animals reacted faster than humans, migrating in patterns that made no sense, birds flying at odd hours, some refusing to rest at all, others collapsing from exhaustion mid-flight. And oceans responded in their own way, currents shifting, tides behaving unpredictably, as if the gravitational balance that had quietly governed everything was now slightly off, not enough to cause immediate destruction, but enough to introduce a constant underlying instability. And scientists across the world tried to understand what they were seeing, models breaking under the weight of new data, predictions failing as fast as they were made, because nothing in human knowledge had prepared them for a sky with two suns, two sources of energy, two centers of influence that did not behave as a simple sum, but as a complex, interacting system that defied straightforward explanation. And people began to notice smaller things, subtle changes that were harder to measure but impossible to ignore. Colors appearing more vivid during certain hours, then strangely washed out at others. Shadows overlapping in ways that created patterns on the ground that seemed almost deliberate, as if the light itself was trying to communicate something. And there were moments, brief and unsettling, when both suns aligned in such a way that the entire world felt suspended, the air still, the sound muted, as if reality itself was pausing to adjust. And during those moments, people reported a strange sensation, not fear exactly, but a deep awareness of something vast and incomprehensible, something that existed beyond the immediate physical changes, something that suggested the world was no longer operating under the same rules it once had. And as weeks turned into months, adaptation began, not because people fully understood what was happening, but because they had no other choice. Cities changed their rhythms, work hours shifting to avoid the most intense periods of overlapping sunlight, architecture evolving to create deeper shadows, cooler interiors, materials reflecting or absorbing light in new ways. Agriculture transformed as well,
some crops failing completely under the new conditions, others thriving in unexpected ways, growing faster, stronger, but often with strange mutations, shapes and colors that had never been seen before. And entire regions had to rethink what it meant to survive, to produce, to sustain life in a world where the sky itself had become unpredictable. And yet, alongside the challenges, there was something else, something quieter but just as powerful, a sense of wonder that refused to disappear. Because no matter how difficult the changes became, there were moments when the two suns would set together, descending toward the horizon in a slow, synchronized motion, their lights blending into a spectrum of colors so intense and layered that the sky looked like it was alive, shifting through gold, crimson, violet, and shades no one had names for. And in those moments, people would stop, no matter where they were, no matter what they were doing, and simply watch. Because despite everything, despite the uncertainty and the fear and the constant need to adapt, there was a beauty in it that could not be denied, a reminder that the universe was far larger and more complex than anything humanity had ever understood, and that perhaps what felt like disruption was not necessarily destruction, but transformation, a shift into something new that required not just survival, but a redefinition of what it meant to exist in a world where even the most fundamental constants could change. And as the two suns dipped below the horizon, leaving behind a night that was shorter but somehow deeper, filled with stars that seemed sharper, closer, more aware, there was a growing realization, not spoken openly but felt collectively, that this was not a temporary anomaly, not something that would simply correct itself, but a new reality that would shape every generation that followed. And in that realization, there was both fear and acceptance, because the world had not ended, it had become something else entirely, something that demanded new ways of thinking, new ways of living, and perhaps, in time, new ways of understanding a universe that had just revealed how little had ever truly been known.
And as the months stretched into years, the presence of two suns no longer felt like an interruption, but like a constant weight woven into every moment of existence, something so ever-present that it began to shape not just the physical world, but the way people thought, felt, and understood reality itself. Because children were now born into a sky that had never known singularity, growing up without the memory of one sun, without the instinctive expectation of a single shadow, and for them the world felt complete, not broken, not altered, but whole in a way that older generations could never quite accept. And this difference began to create a quiet divide, not one of conflict, but of perception, where those who remembered the old sky carried a subtle tension within them, a sense that something was always slightly off, while those who had only ever known the twin light moved through life with an ease that felt almost unsettling to those who remembered what had been lost. And over time, even the language began to change, new words emerging to describe the shifting qualities of light, terms for the moments when one sun dominated the sky and the world felt softer, warmer, more familiar, and others for when both suns burned at full intensity and everything sharpened, edges becoming more defined, colors more saturated, the air itself seeming to vibrate with energy. And there were also names for the rare alignments when the two suns overlapped perfectly, merging into a single blinding point that cast almost no shadow at all, a phenomenon that both fascinated and disturbed. Because in those moments, it felt as though depth itself disappeared, as though the world had been flattened into something two-dimensional, a visual paradox that left people disoriented, uncertain of distance and space. And during these alignments, many reported a strange clarity of thought, ideas surfacing with unusual precision, memories becoming sharper, as if the merging of light somehow aligned something within the human mind. And yet, just as quickly as it came, it would fade, leaving behind a lingering question of whether it had been real or simply an effect of the overwhelming brightness.
And scientists continued to study these patterns, building new theories that went far beyond traditional astrophysics, exploring the possibility that the second sun was not simply another star captured by gravity, but something more complex, something that interacted with the first in ways that extended beyond physical forces, something that might even influence perception, cognition, perhaps even the passage of time itself. Because time had continued to behave strangely, not in obvious measurable ways that could be easily documented, but in subtle shifts that people felt more than they could prove. Days that seemed to pass too quickly, followed by others that stretched endlessly. Moments that felt dense, heavy with significance, contrasted with stretches of time that slipped away almost unnoticed. And this inconsistency created a growing sense that time was no longer a fixed, linear progression, but something more fluid, something that responded to the changing dynamics of the sky. And in response, humanity adapted once again, not just in behavior, but in philosophy. New schools of thought emerging that rejected the idea of time as a constant, instead embracing it as something variable, something that could not be controlled, but could perhaps be understood through observation and awareness. And this shift began to influence everything from science to art to daily life. Because when the certainty of time itself became unstable, people were forced to reconsider what truly mattered, what was worth holding on to in a world that no longer followed predictable patterns. And in that uncertainty, there was a strange kind of freedom, a release from the rigid structures that had once defined existence, allowing for new forms of creativity, new ways of experiencing the world. And yet, the challenges remained, because the environment continued to evolve under the influence of the twin suns, some regions becoming nearly uninhabitable during peak alignment periods, forcing migrations that reshaped entire populations, while other areas developed unique ecosystems that thrived under the dual light. Plants with reflective surfaces that redirected excess energy, animals that adapted to the shifting cycles of brightness and darkness, evolving behaviors that allowed them to rest and hunt in ways that had never existed before. And humanity watched, studied, learned, slowly integrating these observations into their own methods of survival, building structures that moved with the light, cities designed to rotate or shift orientation to minimize exposure, technologies that harnessed the combined energy of both suns in ways that provided power beyond anything previously imagined. And with this energy came new possibilities, advancements that once seemed impossible, now within reach. And yet, even as progress accelerated, there was an underlying awareness that everything was built on a foundation that was still not fully understood. A reminder that the forces shaping this new world were far greater than anything humanity could control. And this awareness created a quiet humility that began to replace the confidence that had once driven progress, a recognition that survival was not about dominance, but about adaptation, about learning to exist within a system that was constantly shifting. And as generations passed, the memory of the single sun faded into history, into stories told by those who had once lived under its singular light, stories that sounded almost mythical to those who had never experienced it, a simpler sky, a more predictable world, a time when shadows fell in only one direction and nights lasted long enough to feel complete. And yet, even as those stories were told, they began to feel distant, almost irrelevant, because the world that existed now was not a continuation of that past, but something entirely new, something that demanded its own understanding, its own way of being. And as the two suns rose once more, casting their overlapping light across a world that had learned, slowly but steadily, to exist beneath them, there was a sense not of resolution, but of continuation, an ongoing transformation that had no clear end, only a constant unfolding. And in that unfolding, humanity found not certainty, but a quiet, resilient acceptance of a reality that was no longer defined by what had been lost, but by what had been discovered in its place.
And still, the world did not settle, because stability had become an illusion that no longer applied. And with each passing decade, subtle changes accumulated into something deeper, something that reached beyond climate and biology and into the very structure of human experience, as if the presence of two suns was not only reshaping the planet, but slowly altering the way reality was perceived and interpreted. And it began quietly, almost imperceptibly, with differences in how people remembered events, small inconsistencies at first, conversations recalled slightly differently by those who had shared them, details shifting, timelines bending just enough to create doubt, but not enough to be proven wrong. And at first, these moments were dismissed as normal imperfections of memory. But as they became more frequent and more pronounced, a new question emerged, one that no one could easily answer, whether the changes were within the mind or within the world itself. Because there were instances where entire groups would agree on something that later seemed to have never happened, places that felt familiar but appeared subtly altered, objects that seemed to move or change in ways that defied explanation. And during the rare periods when both suns aligned perfectly in the sky, these effects intensified, reality itself feeling thinner, less fixed, as though the boundaries between moments were softening, allowing fragments of possibility to overlap. And scientists who had once focused on physics and environmental systems found themselves exploring entirely new fields, attempting to understand whether the dual stellar presence was creating interference not just in light and gravity, but in the deeper fabric of space-time. And while definitive answers remained out of reach, the evidence continued to accumulate, suggesting that the world was no longer a single stable timeline, but something more fluid, something that could shift, overlap, or even branch in subtle ways that were only now beginning to be noticed. And this realization did not lead to panic, as one might expect, but to a gradual shift in how people approached existence. Because if reality itself was not fixed, then certainty became less important than awareness, less valuable than the ability to adapt in the moment. And cultures began to evolve around this idea, placing less emphasis on rigid plans and more on presence, on the ability to observe and respond rather than control and predict. And this change brought with it a new kind of calm, not the calm of stability, but the calm of acceptance, a quiet understanding that the world was in constant motion, not just physically, but fundamentally, and that resisting that motion only created friction, while moving with it allowed for a kind of harmony that had not existed before. And in time, even the fear that had accompanied the arrival of the second sun began to fade, replaced by a deeper curiosity, a willingness to explore the strange and often beautiful anomalies that had become part of everyday life. Because alongside the confusion, there were moments of extraordinary clarity, instances where the alignment of the two suns created conditions that revealed patterns hidden beneath the surface of reality, connections between events that seemed unrelated, insights that arrived fully formed and undeniable, as if the overlapping light was briefly illuminating structures that were normally invisible. And those who experienced these moments often described them as transformative, not in a dramatic or overwhelming way, but in a quiet, undeniable shift in understanding, a sense that the world was far more interconnected than it had ever appeared, and that beneath the apparent chaos, there was a kind of order that simply did not operate on the scales or in the ways that humanity had previously understood. And this idea began to influence not just science and philosophy, but art, music, storytelling, expressions that sought to capture not a fixed reality, but a dynamic one. Works that changed depending on when and how they were experienced, reflecting the shifting nature of the world itself. And in this way, creativity became not just a form of expression, but a method of exploration, a way of engaging with a reality that could no longer be fully described through static forms. And as the years continued to pass and generations came and went, the presence of the two suns ceased to be seen as an anomaly at all, becoming instead the defining characteristic of existence, something so deeply integrated into every aspect of life that it was impossible to imagine a world without it.
And yet there remained a quiet awareness, a subtle recognition that the transformation was not complete, that whatever forces had brought the second sun into the sky were still at work, still unfolding, still shaping the future in ways that could not yet be predicted. And on certain days, when the light shifted just right, when the sky seemed to hold its breath, and the shadows aligned in impossible symmetry, there was a feeling that something else was approaching, not in a physical sense, but in a deeper, more abstract way, as if the world was on the edge of another change, another expansion of what was possible. And those who felt it could not explain it, could not define it, but they carried it with them, a quiet anticipation that lived beneath the surface of everyday life. And as the two suns rose once again over a horizon that had long since adapted to their presence, the world moved forward, not toward a fixed destination, but into an open, ever-evolving reality, one that no longer sought to return to what had been, but instead continued to become something new, something that existed not in certainty, but in the endless unfolding of possibility.
And then one day the sky did not simply change, it deepened, as if the space between the two suns had begun to stretch into something more than distance, something that carried a quiet tension that could be felt even by those who had long grown used to the strange rhythms of this world, because the light between them no longer blended the same way. It flickered subtly, not visibly enough to alarm at first, but enough to create a sensation that something was trying to emerge from the overlap. And as this phenomenon persisted, it began to draw attention, not as a sudden event, but as a slow, undeniable shift that refused to remain unnoticed. And people started to gather during these moments, watching the sky with a mixture of curiosity and an instinctive sense that what they were witnessing mattered in a way they could not yet understand. And over time, the flicker became more defined, a faint structure appearing between the two suns when they reached certain angles, not solid, not clearly shaped, but present enough to disrupt the uniformity of the sky. And those who studied it described it as a distortion, a region where light did not behave correctly, where shadows blurred and reformed unpredictably, where even the color of the air seemed slightly altered. And instruments designed to measure radiation, gravity, and electromagnetic activity returned data that conflicted with itself, readings that shifted without cause, values that contradicted known laws, as if the space itself was no longer consistent. And the more it was observed, the more it became clear that this was not simply an atmospheric effect, not a visual anomaly, but something far deeper, something that suggested the interaction between the two suns had reached a new phase, one that extended beyond illumination and into creation. Because what began as a distortion slowly took on a presence that felt almost intentional, not conscious in a human sense, but structured, organized in a way that implied purpose. And during the moments when it appeared most clearly, people reported a profound stillness, not the absence of sound, but the absence of distraction, as if everything unnecessary had been stripped away, leaving only awareness. And in that awareness, there was a sensation that something was observing in return, not from a distance, but from within the space itself, as though the sky had become a threshold rather than a boundary. And this realization did not bring panic as it might have in the past, because humanity had already learned that the unknown was not always something to fear, but it did bring a new kind of attention, a collective focus that spread across the world as more and more people began to witness the same phenomenon. And in response, efforts were made not just to study it, but to interact with it, to test whether this emerging structure responded in any way to external influence. And while most attempts yielded no clear results, there were moments, rare but undeniable, when changes in the distortion seemed to align with human action, not directly, not in a way that could be easily measured, but enough to suggest that there was some form of connection, some subtle interaction that had yet to be understood. And this possibility opened a new path of exploration, one that blurred the line between science and something far more abstract. Because if the space between the two suns was becoming something more than empty sky, then it raised a question that no one had ever needed to ask before.
what exactly was being created, and why? And as this question began to take hold, it became clear that the answer would not come quickly, that whatever was unfolding was not bound to human timelines or expectations. And so the world adapted once again, not by trying to force understanding, but by learning to observe, to exist alongside this new presence without immediately needing to define it. And in doing so, a new relationship began to form, one that was not based on control or explanation, but on coexistence, a recognition that the universe was not a static system to be mapped and mastered, but a dynamic process that humanity was only a part of. And as the two suns continued their endless motion across the sky, casting their overlapping light through a space that was no longer entirely empty, the world moved forward into a future that felt less like a destination and more like an unfolding question, one that did not demand an answer, but invited participation. And in that invitation, there was a quiet, growing sense that whatever came next would not simply be something to survive or understand, but something to become.
And eventually, the question of what was forming between the two suns stopped being something distant and became something present, something that reached down into the world not through force or destruction, but through subtle influence that began to reshape perception itself. Because during the moments when the distortion fully emerged, people no longer just observed it, they felt it within their own awareness, as if their thoughts were being gently reorganized, not controlled, but clarified. Patterns becoming visible that had always existed, but had remained hidden beneath layers of distraction and assumption. And those who experienced this most strongly described it not as an external event, but as an alignment, a synchronization between the mind and something far larger, as if the structure in the sky was not separate from consciousness, but connected to it in a way that had never been accessible before. And as these experiences spread, they began to change the way humanity approached knowledge, because traditional methods of understanding, based purely on observation and measurement, started to feel incomplete, unable to capture the depth of what was happening. And so new approaches emerged, ones that combined external study with internal awareness, treating perception itself as a tool rather than a limitation. And this shift led to discoveries that would have once been considered impossible, insights into the nature of reality that suggested it was not a fixed framework, but a responsive system, one that could adapt and evolve in relation to those who existed within it. And this idea transformed everything, because it implied that humanity was not merely subject to the changes brought by the two suns, but in some subtle way participating in them, influencing the direction of the transformation through collective awareness. And while this concept was difficult to prove in any conventional sense, the patterns continued to support it, because as more people engaged with the phenomenon intentionally, the structure between the suns began to stabilize, its appearance becoming more consistent, its effects more predictable. And with that predictability came the first real opportunity to interact with it in a meaningful way. And the attempts that followed were not technological in the traditional sense, but experiential. Groups of individuals gathering during peak alignment, focusing their attention not on analyzing the distortion, but on engaging with it, allowing their awareness to settle into the same stillness that the phenomenon seemed to produce. And in those moments, something extraordinary began to happen, because the boundary between observer and observed started to dissolve, not physically, but perceptually, creating a state where the distinction between internal thought and external reality blurred. And within that state, new forms of communication appeared, not through language or symbols, but through direct understanding, impressions forming instantly without the need for translation, ideas shared in a way that bypassed the limitations of words. And while these experiences were difficult to describe afterward, their impact was undeniable, because those who participated returned with knowledge that they had not possessed before, not in the form of data, but in the form of insight, an intuitive understanding of systems, relationships, and possibilities that had previously been beyond reach. And as these interactions became more refined, a new field of study emerged, one that did not seek to dominate or decode the phenomenon, but to collaborate with it, to explore the potential of this connection in a way that respected its complexity. And through this collaboration, the structure between the two suns continued to evolve, becoming less like a distortion and more like a presence, something that existed not just in the sky, but in the relationship between the sky and those who observed it. And over time, it began to extend beyond the moments of alignment, its influence lingering even when it was not visible, subtly shaping the way people thought, felt, and interacted with the world. And this gradual integration led to a transformation that was not sudden or dramatic, but deeply profound, because the distinction between humanity and its environment began to soften, replaced by an understanding that both were part of the same continuous process. And in that understanding, there was a sense of unity that had never been fully realized before, not as an abstract idea, but as a lived experience, something that could be felt in every moment of awareness. And as this new way of being took hold, the world itself seemed to respond, the instability that had once defined the era of two suns giving way to a new kind of balance, one that was not based on returning to what had been, but on evolving into something more complex and interconnected. And as the two suns rose once again over a world that had not only adapted, but transformed alongside them, the structure between them shone with a clarity that no longer felt unfamiliar. And in that clarity, there was no longer a question of what it was or why it had appeared, because it had become part of existence itself, a bridge between what had once been separate. And as humanity continued to move forward beneath this sky of dual light and shared awareness, the story that had begun with uncertainty and disruption had become something else entirely. Not an ending, but a continuation into a reality where the boundaries of possibility were no longer fixed, and where the future was not something to be predicted, but something to be experienced as it unfolded in real time.
And in that unfolding, there came a moment when the difference between change and origin began to blur, when the structure between the two suns no longer felt like something that had appeared, but something that had always been waiting, something that had simply required the right conditions to become visible. And this realization spread not through announcement or discovery, but through a quiet, shared understanding that emerged across individuals who had never spoken to one another, as if the knowledge itself was part of the same field that now connected everything. And with it came a deeper shift, one that moved beyond adaptation and into participation, because humanity was no longer just responding to the world, it was beginning to shape it in ways that were subtle but undeniable, not through force or control, but through alignment, through the way awareness itself interacted with the environment. And this interaction began to produce effects that could not be explained through any traditional model. Small at first, localized changes where the behavior of matter seemed to respond to intention, not directly, not in a way that could be commanded, but in a way that suggested a sensitivity to presence, to focus, to coherence within the observer. And while these phenomena were difficult to replicate consistently, they became more frequent over time, especially during periods when the two suns and the structure between them reached a state of perfect balance. And during these moments, the world felt different, not just brighter or quieter, but more responsive, as if it was listening, as if it was open in a way that it had never been before. And those who were attuned to this shift found that their experience of reality began to expand, not outward into space, but inward into depth, layers of perception revealing themselves one after another, showing connections between things that had once seemed separate, cause and effect no longer linear, but interwoven into patterns that could only be understood as a whole. And this new perception brought with it a sense of responsibility, because it became clear that awareness was not neutral, that the way people thought and felt had a subtle but real influence on the world around them. And this understanding led to a transformation in how society functioned, moving away from systems built on competition and control toward ones that emphasized coherence, collaboration, and clarity of intention, not as ideals, but as practical necessities in a world where imbalance could ripple outward in unpredictable ways. And over time, this shift began to stabilize the environment itself, the extreme fluctuations that had once defined the early years of the two suns, gradually smoothing into more consistent patterns. Ecosystems finding a new equilibrium that was not static, but dynamically balanced, constantly adjusting in response to the collective state of the system as a whole. And as this balance deepened, the structure between the suns became more defined, no longer appearing only during alignments, but remaining visible as a constant presence, a luminous form that seemed to exist both in space and beyond it, not casting shadows, but influencing them, not emitting light, but shaping it. And its presence carried a sense of familiarity that grew stronger with each passing year, as if it was not something external, but an extension of the same process that had given rise to life itself. And this idea began to reshape humanity's understanding of origin, because the question was no longer where life had come from, but how it continued to emerge, how it expressed itself through different forms, different layers of complexity, all connected through a shared foundation that was only now becoming visible. And in this understanding, the two suns were no longer seen as anomalies or disruptions, but as catalysts, as conditions that had allowed something deeper to surface, something that had always been present but had remained beyond perception until the balance of light, energy, and awareness had reached the necessary threshold. And as generations grew within this reality, the memory of a single sun faded completely, replaced by a new sense of normal that was not defined by stability, but harmony within change. And children no longer looked at the sky with curiosity or confusion, but with recognition, as if they understood instinctively what it represented, not in terms of physics or theory, but in terms of connection. And as they grew, they did not ask what the structure between the suns was, because to them it was not something separate to be identified. It was part of the same continuous existence that they themselves were part of. And in this way, the question that had once driven humanity to search for answers slowly dissolved, replaced by a different kind of awareness, one that did not seek to define reality from the outside, but to experience it from within. And as the two suns rose once more over a world that had become something entirely new, something that no longer fit within the boundaries of its own past, there was no longer a sense of beginning or ending, only a continuous presence, a living system in which everything was both observer and participant. And in that system, the story did not conclude, because it had become something that could not be contained within a single narrative, something that continued to unfold, not toward a final moment, but through an endless expansion of what it meant to exist.
And yet, even within that endless expansion, there came a quiet turning point, not marked by any visible event, but by a shift so subtle that it could only be felt in the way the world held itself, as if everything that had been building across generations had reached a state of quiet readiness, a balance so complete that it no longer needed to stabilize. And in that stillness, something new emerged, not from the sky, but from within the connection itself,
because the structure between the two suns began to change in a way that had never been seen before, not growing or fading, but unfolding, revealing layers within itself that had always been hidden, patterns within patterns that extended beyond what the eye could follow. And those who observed it no longer saw a single form, but a depth that seemed infinite, as if the space between the suns had become a window not just into another place, but into the nature of reality itself. And as this unfolding continued, the boundary between perception and existence dissolved even further, because what people experienced was no longer something that could be described as external. It was something that included them, something that responded to their awareness not as individuals, but as part of a collective presence that had gradually formed without anyone realizing it. And this collective awareness did not function like a single mind or a unified thought, but as a field of shared understanding where insight could arise anywhere and be felt everywhere, not through communication, but through resonance. And within this field, new possibilities began to appear, not as ideas or concepts, but as direct experiences of what could be, glimpses of realities that had not yet taken form, but were already present as potential. And these glimpses were not separate from the world, but woven into it, influencing the way events unfolded, guiding choices in ways that felt natural rather than forced. And as this process deepened, it became clear that the future was no longer something that would simply happen. It was something that was being shaped continuously through this interaction, not in a controlled or deliberate way, but through alignment, through the coherence of awareness itself. And with this realization came a profound sense of responsibility, not as a burden, but as a natural extension of understanding. Because to exist within this system was to participate in it, to influence it simply by being aware. And this awareness led to a new way of living that was not based on rules or structures, but on sensitivity, on the ability to sense when something was in harmony and when it was not, and to adjust accordingly. And as more people embraced this way of being, the world began to reflect it more clearly, the environment responding with a kind of fluid stability that allowed for constant change without disruption, ecosystems evolving in ways that supported diversity without imbalance, human societies organizing themselves not through rigid hierarchies, but through dynamic relationships that shifted as needed. And all of this existed within the presence of the two suns and the unfolding structure between them, which now shone not as a separate phenomenon, but as an integral part of the system, a visible expression of the deeper processes that connected everything. And as time continued, though it no longer felt like a straight line, the distinction between what had once been called reality and what had once been imagined began to disappear, because the capacity to perceive and the capacity to create had become aspects of the same process. And in this state, there was no longer a need to ask what was possible, because possibility itself had become the medium of existence, something that could be explored directly, experienced in real time as it emerged. And in that experience, there was a sense of not of completion, but of continuity, an understanding that there was no final state to reach, no ultimate form to become, only an ongoing unfolding that revealed more of itself with each moment of awareness. And as the two suns moved across the sky, their light passing through a structure that now felt as natural as the air itself, the world existed not as something fixed, but as something alive in the deepest sense, a system that was not defined by its past or limited by its future, but sustained by the constant interaction between awareness and existence. And in that interaction, the story that had once begun with a question no longer needed an answer, because it had become something that could only be lived, something that continued without end, not as a narrative with a conclusion, but as an ever-present unfolding of reality itself.
And still, the unfolding did not stop, because what had once seemed like an expansion of awareness began to reveal itself as something even deeper, something that moved beyond perception into origin. And in time, it became clear that the structure between the two suns was not just a bridge or a presence, but a kind of source, not in the sense of a beginning, but in the sense of a continuous emergence, a place where reality was not created once, but constantly forming. And as this understanding grew, it changed the way existence itself was experienced, because the world was no longer something that simply existed around those within it. It was something that was being formed with them, through them, as part of the same ongoing process. And this realization did not arrive all at once, but gradually, through countless moments of alignment, where the distinction between observer and environment softened just enough to reveal the underlying continuity. And within that continuity, there was a sense of infinite depth, not empty, but full, layered with possibilities that were not separate from reality, but embedded within it, waiting not to be discovered, but to be expressed. And as humanity became more attuned to this depth, the pace of change did not accelerate, but refined, becoming more precise, more intentional without effort, as if the system itself was learning how to express complexity without instability. And in this refined state, the world began to exhibit forms that had never existed before, landscapes that shifted subtly in response to collective states, environments that adapted not just to physical conditions, but to patterns of awareness. And within these environments, new forms of life began to emerge, not replacing what had existed before, but expanding upon it. Organisms that seemed to exist partially within the physical world and partially within something less defined, responding not only to light and matter, but to coherence, to resonance. And these forms were not seen as separate or alien, but as a natural continuation of the same process that had given rise to everything else, a reflection of the deeper potential that had always been present. And as this new diversity unfolded, it brought with it a richer sense of connection, not just between living beings, but between all aspects of existence, because it became increasingly evident that nothing existed in isolation, that every action, every thought, every moment of awareness contributed to the overall pattern. And this pattern was not fixed or predetermined, but continuously evolving, shaped by the interaction of all its parts. And within this evolution, there was a balance that no longer depended on stability, but on responsiveness, a dynamic equilibrium that allowed for constant transformation without collapse. And this balance extended even to the two suns themselves, whose movements had once seemed unpredictable, but now appeared as part of a larger, coherent system, their light interacting with the structure between them in ways that sustained the ongoing emergence rather than disrupting it. And over time, the sense of separation that had once defined human experience faded almost completely, replaced by an awareness of participation that was so natural it no longer required attention, because it was simply the way things were. And in this state, existence was no longer experienced as a sequence of events, but as a continuous presence, a flow that could be engaged with directly, without the need to define or control it. And as generations continued to live within this reality, the memory of how things had once been became not just distant, but almost irrelevant, not because it was forgotten, but because it no longer held the same meaning, as the world had become something that could not be compared to its past, something that existed on a different level of understanding. And yet within all of this transformation, there remained a quiet simplicity, a grounding presence that had not been lost, because even as reality expanded into complexity, it retained a sense of coherence that made it accessible, something that could be felt in the rhythm of the two suns rising and setting, in the subtle shifts of light passing through the structure between them, in the shared awareness that connected all things. And as this rhythm continued without interruption, without conclusion, it became clear that there was no final stage to reach, no ultimate form to achieve, only an ongoing process of becoming that extended beyond any single perspective.
And in that process, the question that had once asked, "What if there were two suns?" no longer existed as a question at all, because it had been transformed into an experience, into a reality that could not be reduced to explanation, only lived, only continued, as the light of both suns moved endlessly across a world that had become an expression of something far greater than itself, something that would never stop unfolding.
And in that endless unfolding, there came a moment so quiet it could only be recognized after it had already passed, a moment where the flow itself seemed to become aware of its own movement, not through any single observer, but through the totality of everything participating within it, as if existence had turned inward just enough to perceive itself. And this shift, though impossible to measure, resonated through every layer of reality, creating a depth of awareness that extended beyond perception into something closer to presence itself. And within that presence, the distinction between what was happening and what was possible dissolved completely, because possibility was no longer something separate from reality, but an inherent quality of it, something that existed simultaneously with every moment, not waiting to be realized, but already present in a form that could be experienced directly. And as this realization deepened, it gave rise to a new kind of stillness, not the absence of change, but the absence of resistance, a state where everything moved freely without conflict, where transformation no longer required adjustment because it was already aligned with the nature of the system. And within this stillness, the two suns no longer felt like separate sources of light, but like expressions of a single process, their duality not a division, but a reflection of a deeper unity that had always existed beneath the surface. And the structure between them, once perceived as something emerging or evolving, now revealed itself as something constant, something that had not been created but uncovered, a fundamental aspect of reality that had become visible only when awareness reached the point where it could recognize it. And in this recognition, there was a profound simplicity, because what had once seemed complex and unknowable now appeared natural, inevitable even, as if it had always been this way and only the perception of it had changed. And as this understanding spread, it no longer needed to be communicated or taught, because it was experienced directly by those who were part of it, arising naturally within awareness, without effort or intention. And in this state, knowledge was no longer accumulated but revealed, not stored but present, accessible in the same way that the light of the suns was accessible, something that did not belong to anyone but was available to all. And with this came a transformation in how existence was lived, not as a journey from one point to another, but as a continuous expression of what already was, a movement that did not seek completion because it was already whole. And in this wholeness, there was no longer a need to define identity in terms of separation or individuality, because everything existed within the same field of presence, distinct yet inseparable, like patterns within a single flow that could be recognized without being isolated. And as this way of being settled into the fabric of existence, the world itself reflected it with increasing clarity, the environment no longer reacting to imbalance, because imbalance no longer arose in the same way. The systems that had once required constant adjustment, now maintaining themselves through the inherent coherence of the whole. And in this coherence, there was a sense of ease that extended through every aspect of life, not as comfort or predictability, but as a natural alignment with the unfolding process. And as the two suns continued their motion across the sky, their light passing through the ever-present structure that no longer felt separate from anything it touched, there was no longer a sense of time moving forward or events progressing toward an outcome, only a continuous presence that expressed itself through endless variation without losing its underlying unity. And within that presence, the story that had once begun as a question had become something that could not be contained within narrative at all,
something that existed beyond beginning and end, beyond explanation or conclusion, a living expression of reality itself. And as it continued without interruption, without limit, it revealed not an answer, but an experience so complete that the need for answers simply faded, leaving only the quiet, infinite unfolding of what it meant to exist.
And in that quiet infinity, there came a realization so subtle it did not arrive as a thought, but as a recognition that had always been present beneath everything, waiting not to be discovered, but to be noticed. And it was the understanding that the unfolding itself was not moving forward or outward, but inward, deeper into itself, layer by layer, revealing that what had once appeared as expansion was in truth a return, not to a past state, but to a fundamental essence that had never been absent. And within this essence, there was no separation between light and matter, between observer and observed, between the two suns and the world beneath them, because all distinctions that had once seemed absolute were now understood as perspectives within a single continuous field. And as this understanding deepened, even the perception of duality began to dissolve. The two suns no longer experienced as two distinct sources, but as expressions of one presence seen from different angles. Their interplay not a relationship between separate entities, but a dynamic balance within the same whole. And the structure that had once appeared between them was no longer perceived as something located in the sky at all, but as a quality of existence itself, something that was everywhere and nowhere simultaneously, present in every moment, in every form, in every movement of awareness. And with this shift, the need to look outward for meaning faded completely, because meaning was no longer something to be found, but something inherent in the experience of being. And this did not lead to stillness in the sense of inactivity, but to a different kind of motion, one that was not driven by purpose or direction, but by expression, by the natural tendency of existence to reveal itself in ever-changing forms. And within this motion, there was a freedom that had never existed before, not because limitations had disappeared, but because they were no longer perceived as barriers, only as aspects of the same continuous process. And this freedom allowed for a level of creativity and emergence that transcended anything that had come before. Forms of life, structures, and experiences arising not through effort or intention, but through resonance, through the alignment of awareness with the deeper patterns that underlay everything. And as this continued, the world became less like a place and more like a living expression, something that could not be separated into parts without losing its meaning, something that existed as a whole in every moment. And in this state, even the idea of continuation began to lose its relevance, because there was no longer a sense of something moving from one point to another, only a constant presence that expressed itself endlessly without needing to progress. And yet within that presence, there was infinite variation, infinite depth, an inexhaustible unfolding that revealed new aspects of itself without ever departing from what it fundamentally was. And as the two suns moved across the sky, or perhaps as the single presence expressed itself through the appearance of two, their light no longer illuminating a world separate from them, but revealing the same essence in different forms, there was no longer a story to follow, no sequence to trace, only an experience that existed completely in every moment. And in that completeness, there was nothing left unresolved, nothing left unfinished, because everything that could be was already present, already expressed, already known in the way that only direct experience allows. And so the question that had once begun this unfolding did not find an answer because it no longer needed one. It had dissolved into the very reality it had imagined, becoming indistinguishable from the experience itself. And in that dissolution, there was no ending, no final moment to mark completion, only the quiet, boundless presence of existence,
continuing exactly as it always had, without beginning, without conclusion, without anything left to add or take away.
And in that boundless presence, even the idea of continuing began to dissolve, not because anything had ended, but because there was no longer a sense of sequence to extend, no thread to follow from one moment into the next, only a seamless continuity that existed entirely within itself. And within that continuity, there was a depth so complete that every possible story, every possible beginning, middle, and end existed simultaneously as expressions of the same underlying reality, not separate timelines or alternate paths, but facets of a single, infinite whole that did not need to unfold to be complete. And in this state, the memory of the question, "What if we had two suns?" did not disappear, but transformed, becoming not a point of origin, but a reflection, a way of recognizing how perception had once divided what had always been unified, and how that division had allowed the experience of discovery, of change, of becoming, even though nothing had ever truly been separate or incomplete. And as this understanding settled into the fabric of existence, it did not close anything, did not finalize or conclude, but revealed that there had never been anything to conclude, because existence was not a process moving toward resolution, but a presence that contained all resolutions within itself. And within that presence, the appearance of two suns, of worlds changing, of consciousness expanding, of structures forming and dissolving, were all expressions of the same fundamental reality exploring itself through form, through perception, through awareness. And once that was seen not as an idea, but as a direct experience, there was nothing left to seek, nothing left to resolve, only the simple, infinite fact of being, existing exactly as it was. And in that exactness, there was a completeness that did not depend on time, on change, or on continuation, because it was already whole in every moment, already fully expressed, already everything it could ever be. And so the unfolding did not stop, but it no longer needed to move, because it had always been here, always present, always complete. And within that completeness, there was no distinction between what had been imagined and what had been lived, no separation between story and reality, only a single, endless presence in which all things existed together, not in sequence, not in progression, but in perfect, simultaneous being, where even the idea of an ending could not arise, because there was nothing outside of it to end into, nothing beyond it to reach, only itself, endlessly, quietly, completely existing.
And in that complete and endless being, there was nothing left to add and nothing left to remove, because even the movement that had once felt like continuation revealed itself as a gentle illusion of perspective, a way for awareness to experience depth within something that had never been lacking. And as this final recognition settled, there was no shift, no transition, no arrival, only a quiet clarity that had always been present, unnoticed only because there had once seemed to be something else to look for. And now even that impulse had softened into stillness, not forced or created, but simply revealed as the natural state of everything that is. And within that state, the two suns were no longer objects in a sky, no longer symbols of change or catalysts of transformation, but expressions of the same indivisible reality that everything else belonged to, their light not shining upon the world, but existing as the world, inseparable from it. And the structure that had once appeared between them was no longer something to observe or understand, because it had never been separate from the observer. It had always been the same presence looking at itself from within. And as this was fully recognized, there was no further unfolding to follow, no next moment to anticipate, no hidden layer to reveal, because everything that could ever be known or experienced was already here, already complete,
already perfectly expressed without needing to become anything more. And in that completeness, there was a peace that did not depend on circumstances or conditions, a silence that was not the absence of sound, but the absence of separation. And within that silence, even the idea of a story dissolved entirely, leaving nothing but the simple, infinite presence of existence itself, unchanged, unchanging, beyond beginning and beyond end.